Welcome everyone, it's Neil here from 3D Tudor, and today we'll be going back to our complete speed model guides. Something we haven't done for a few weeks now. Just a couple of things before we start. If you could like this video and drop a comment down below to help us grow the channel, that would be absolutely amazing, guys. At the moment, we're really trying to grow this YouTube channel, and any help you can give us, we would be extremely grateful for. If you missed our modular pack, which will be out as a course this month, then check out the links down below. And if you want to grab it for pretty much free, then come join our Patreon, which is the best value for money Patreon out there anywhere. So just check that out and you can decide for yourself if you think it is the best Patreon out there. But enough of all that. What you're here for is to see how we put together our Stylized Wok kitchen. So here it goes, everyone. Cheers. So the first thing we're going to do is bring in a human OBJ, and this is just to make everything to scale. And you saw there as well that also I gathered already a load of references, which is going to make this build much easier. I always recommend gathering as many references as you can so you have a clear idea of what you're going to do. Of course, things can change when you're actually building the actual model out, and you might have some new ideas, and then I simply go and get some more references for the whatever idea I've got once I'm building it. Now at the moment what I'm doing is I'm actually building out the grey box, and this is then going to set me up so that I can come in and actually build all those little parts individually. But I think it's important on something like this with this actual build to build out the actual grey box first, because it just makes it easier to where everything's going to go. I would never just come in and build the building just straight out. And I also do this for the courses when I'm building those. I actually grey box them out first. So at the moment, I'm not really caring about topology or anything like that. All I'm thinking about is where things are going to go, how big the structure is actually going to be, and how I'm going to fit basically everything I want to within the structure. You can even see that when I'm building like simple stools and things like that, I'm just actually building just simple models, you know, inserting there to get my 4 actual legs and then pulling them out, and then that's basically it. Now the one thing I am going to work on though is the actual roof, because the roof is actually a very integral part. So I decided to actually go ahead and create my roof before anything else, because I knew like everything would kind of fit around here. So you can see what I've done with the roof is I've made that simple actual cylinder there. I've actually solidified it, and then what I've done is I've arrayed it out. So I've got basically 2 arrays on here going across to the actual length of my roof, and I'm going to do the same thing with the tiles. So with the tiles, you can see all I did was I split them up. I filled in those gaps then on each side, and then I beveled them off, and then I've got, I think, 3 arrays actually on here. So 1 going for the 3, and then the 3 across to the end of the roof, and then finally going up to the top of the roof. And then all I do is just simply rotate them back, and that gives me that nice roof. Now the other thing I want to do is put some ends on these actual parts. So all I did was I used, basically changed my transformation to local. And that then enabled me to just Shift D, pull it out, and then put those ends on. Now you can see what I'm doing is I'm using Simple Deform, and that gives us that real Japanese type feel of this actual building that we're going to go for. And just be aware that when you're actually using this Simple Deform, just make sure that you've reset your transformations before. And if it's actually not going the right way, we actually have a video on Simple Deform on the channel. And basically what you need to do is you need to rotate it around in edit mode, and then rotate it back in object mode. And then you're able to get that kind of whatever curve you're actually looking for, whether that's a round wall or something like this actual roof. On this roof, I actually had to do it a couple of times just to get the actual shape that I'm actually looking for. Next, what I decided to do is make the other roof. Now this roof was supposed to be made of some type of plastic, so I knew I needed a lot of waviness in this, not really a solid structure or anything like that. And all I did is I just separated the ends of it, and then I could actually bend them out. Now to add to the actual feel of this building, I knew that the actual block of wood on the top, it needed to be kind of bent in a little bit, you know, look kind of weathered and things like that. Now again with the steps, I'm just only grey boxing the steps out. These are not actually going to be the finished steps, and I recommend that you just grey box some steps out, and that will give you an idea of how high and how far it's actually going to come out. Finally now I'm just going to finish the back of the model The question always is, do you want a full diorama? Do you want to be able to rotate around the whole building? Or do you just want to be able to see it from the front and sides? And on this one, I actually just went for the front and sides. I didn't really want to bother with the back, you know, putting bins and things like that in the back. I didn't want to do anything like that. This is just a simple piece from the actual front. You could actually go in and put some things in the back anyway, because in the end, the back is actually textured really nicely as well. So now next of all, I'm thinking about my lighting. How many lights am I going to have in here? What's actually going to be kind of lighting up the scene? Because on something like this, I kind of wanted it a little bit dark to actually really accentuate all the things that I've got in there. Kind of this setting sun type feel is what I was going for, which is what Japan's actually famous for, so that's what I was going for. Moving on now, I just created in Blender a simple fish shape. Decided that's probably not going to work, so what I did was I decided instead to go in and create it in ZBrush. Now, of course, you could create this in Blender itself. The other reason I created that simple fish there that you saw that I brought in was to give me kind of the right scale of what I'm actually going for. So now what I'm doing is I'm only using a few brushes here, and I'm just creating the outline of the fish to start with. I always recommend doing it like that, because this is actual stylized. You can, even if you don't really know a lot about sculpting or anything like that, you can really get away with things once it's like this, because a lot of the work is going to be done with the actual textures. As long as you've got a lot of lumps and things like that in there, that then is going to give you some nice curvature, and that then is what enables something like Substance Painter to give you that really hand-painted actual feel to the actual fish. Next, we're going to put in just some temporary eyes and a temporary spine, and that then gives me enough of an idea of where to actually put the things like the fins and the tail and things like that. So to do the tail, all I did is I brought in a cube. The first thing I do when I bring in anything is I turn on my Dynamesh. I Dynamesh it, and then what that does is, as I'm actually pulling it out, especially with something like this where it's got kind of a lot of thin parts, then I can actually Dynamesh it on the fly, and that then gives me a lot more kind of topology to actually work with, and a much easier time to actually shape it. Next, what I'll do is I'll probably turn up the Dynamesh a little bit, re-Dynamesh it, and then put it in the details. On something like this, of course, I didn't really have to do that so much, because it kind of is very simple design. I think something like this, anyone's really able to do, no matter your skill level, or no matter if you're new to sculpting, because it's an actual simple design. And all you need to basically focus on is kind of the silhouette of the fish, rather than all the tiny details. We're also going to make sure that on this particular part, we do have a high poly and a low poly for the fish, so that we can bake it within Substance Painter. And as I say, that way, then we're able to get that curvature. So now you can see I've just decimated that down, and now I'm bringing in the fish. And this is, of course, is the high poly version. You can see down the bottom, my actual polygon count has gone pretty high. Now, to bend the fish, you could use proportional editing or something like that, but I prefer to use a lattice. It gives you a lot of control over all the bends, and you know, you're able to bend it in a really nice way with a lattice. So to add a lattice, it's just Shift A. It's under the primitives menu. Bring it in, make it the same size of whatever object you want to bend, and then all you do is you add in a modifier, which will be the lattice, and then you can actually turn up the amount of edge loops going around that lattice, and that then gives you the bend. Really simple and easy to use. So now this is something that I actually did on the fly. I decided, okay, I think we'd have a cleaver in this or something. It's going to make it really nice, really stylized. That's the sort of look I'm going for. If this was going more for realism, then obviously there won't be a great big cleaver sticking out of the fish or anything like that. So I knew just to make a quick cleaver, bring in a subdivision once you've got the basic shape, add in some edge loops, and that then will make it really easy to kind of get that shape that you're actually looking for. Alright, now what I'm doing is I'm just putting it into place, turning it at an angle. It's always nice to turn things at a different angle. You don't want anything going really straight on. Next, I'm just adding a quick boolean just to put that hole in there to give it that kind of stylized cleaver look. And now I'm on to the actual inside of the kitchen. So first of all, I'm going to create an actual fridge. Again, the easiest way to do this with something that is stylized is to use a subdivision and a bevel. And you can see there, that's really nice sides and smoothness that I've got on my fridge. Before we do the oven though, it's time to do the handles. And with the handles, I'm just going to bring in a curve I'm going to bring in, I think it's a path that I brought in there, just bend it out slightly. Make sure you turn down the resolutions or you'll end up with too many polygons in such a small handle. And then to apply it, all you do is go up to Object, Convert, and Mesh. So next of all, I'm just doing the tops for the actual oven. One of them will be somewhere where they're chopping up food, and the other side will be the actual hob, where all the pans and things like that are going to be cooking away on. Just remember that when you pull this out, make sure that you put even on the offset, so then it pulls out nice and even on the bottom there. Now I'm onto the front of the oven, and basically what I'm trying to do here is think about how the actual textures are going to look. I want the basically oven to be one type of metal and then the front of it to be another with a little glass on the front there. Now making the hobs, and just to pull that part out, I need to actually join some of the vertices together. So you just click on one, click on the other one, press J, and then it will form an actual edge for you there. Make sure as well, whenever you're building anything like this, to always, like for instance with the knobs on the oven, just make sure they're all turned to different angles, and it really does, the eye really picks up things like that, giving a lot more randomness to your build. It doesn't look so straight. A lot of times when people are building things, I'll see a medieval street and all of the houses are exactly the same. None of the wood's bent or anything. And what it does is it just makes it look too clean. And it really takes a lot away. So whenever you're building things, just try and bend the wood like I'm doing here with the shelves. Just that slight bit, and you'd be surprised how far that actually goes. You can see as well, this is quite a simple design. So the actual inside of the kitchen isn't taking that much time to actually create it. The actual most amount of time on this actual build is adding all the little details in, which in the end I got kind of tired of doing because it was a lot of plates, a lot of noodles and things like that, and they just take a long time, even though a lot of it is done with textures. But once you've got these parts, I guess you can reuse them over and over again using the Blender Asset Manager, so that does make it much easier. Now what I'm doing is I'm actually fixing those grey box walls, so I'm just making sure that the walls are the right scale and size. All the mesh is fixed with the topology. You can see here I'm trying to work out now what is actually going to be in that back, because I'd kind of planned for the oven part with the fridge and the food, but in the back part, not really planned that out so much. Sometimes that happens. Now here I'm just putting in a kind of one of those curtains. If you've ever been to Chinese takeaway shop or anything like that, normally they've got these plastic curtains there, and that's what I'm actually going to put in there. And I think Luke, when he first textured this, he thought it was wood or some bamboo or something. So we ended up with this wood to start with, but then we changed it so it was a nice red and white plastic. Now at this point we're just trying to fit everything together. Don't need to worry too much about how far the walls come in, because basically we're going to put a top on there, so you're not going to see those. And now I know that I need to fix the front of this, and the way I'm going to do that is, first of all, I'm going to pull everything down, making it fit into place. Again, whenever I'm building something, even if it's stylized, still making sure that the structure looks right, so everything's kind of fitted together, everything's kind of supported well. Now I'm just going to take the front of here, and I'm just going to make it so the topology is right. This was kind of broken, this part, from, just building a simple grey box. So basically the easiest way is just kind of either build it again or take it apart and then add in more topology to it where it's needed to make sure we have no engons. So now the wooden slats here, very easy to do. All I did is I brought in a plane, added some actual edge loops going across. Make sure to mark the seams before you do anything, and then you add in some more edge loops, and what that enables you to do is easily split it up, and then using proportional editing with with random on, you can actually pull out and pull them to different scales and things like that really easily. Makes them really uneven. And then the final thing you can do is you can go to mesh, and under there you'll see one that says transformation, and under there you'll see one that says random. Turn that down to like 0.1, 0.2, something like that, and you'll see it really helps kind of randomize all that wood, make it look all uneven really easily. So next of all, I have to think how I'm going to fill in the kind of holes. So we've got a lot of holes going up to the roof, a lot of holes in the sides, and I needed to do something to keep with the actual theme, so I decided to actually use bamboo, and it actually turned out really nicely. And then all I'm going to do is I'm just going to get them in place, and then I think I'm going to use the piece of wood that's already there to actually boolean, and that then enables me to get rid of the tops of them. Now it does cause a few problems in the end, so what I decided to do in the end is just make sure that you go to mesh and clean up, and then just delete loose, and that will delete all those loose ends on the top. You got to do this because when you bring it through to UV unwrapping, you will end up with a kind of mess of a UV map if you don't actually clean it up. So it's kind of the last things you should do anyway. Once you finish your build, make sure you've cleaned. Make sure you triangulate things that need triangulating. Make sure that you clean up loose ends. Get rid of any topology that's not needed. Make sure your normals are facing the correct way. And of course, all these things are covered in near enough all of the courses that we produce. So now you can see I'm moving on to the pots and pans. Just trying to get some really, really nice shapes. A lot of the references I got, they had just a ton of, different pans, different plates. And that enabled me to actually create a really, really nice variation. I tend to as well bounce around, and the reason I do that is just so I don't get bored. So I don't want to get bored creating too many pots and pans, so I kind of then moved on to the chair, trying to keep within the same theme. That's something that's very hard to do. And it's very hard to do because until you've done this a lot of times, you're kind of fumbling around a little bit. Once you get used though to, right, okay, this is the theme that we're going to do. A bit like Overwatch. If you've played Overwatch, you'll see, for instance, Roadhog, and you see the theme that they went for, and it all kind of fits together well. Yeah, that's on a much higher level, but that's kind of what you're looking for. So everything should kind of fit into the theme of whatever skin that is. Again, here, as I talk about a lot, it's all about how things are supported. Do they look right? Is there enough support in there? We don't just want that piece of cloth just hanging over with no supports. Now I'm coming back to the kind of little props, and this will be one of the menus on the board. And again, you can see I've not actually gone back to the plates or anything like that yet, because I'm kind of making sure, again, that I'm keeping the build exciting for myself. You can see as well that all I did there was just rotate them round on the Z, rotate them slightly on the Y or X, and then it just gave the illusion of a lot of different plates stacked up. So you can see you can do a lot of things with just these small amount of items. And it is really now about actually filling up that space. And you can see now I'm back on my plates, creating a few more different plates. And then you'll see again that I do move on and kind of bounce to something else, as I've done here with the steps. And I'm just wondering how I'm going to create these steps. And you can see that I just started with a cube and then just brought it out, matched the actual scale of the steps. And now you can see it's a nice topology. We could have gone and put an edge on those steps, but I think the actual amount of, the textures did the work for us there. All right, so now we're looking at an actual, putting a plant pot. I think here is where I come to actually make the actual tree. So all I'm doing is I'm control right clicking, and then I'm using the skin. And what that enables me to do then is actually create the branches. I've actually put it in place there as well, just to make it a little bit easier for me to where I actually need it to go. And you'll see this technique really is a nice way to actually bring everything out where you actually need it. Now you can see I'm using a subdivision surface. I think what I'll do is I'll do a short on that to actually show you how that's actually done. And now you can see I'm actually using just a sphere just to get the actual tops of these plants. We're not going to actually use these, but what we're going to do is use this to actually place where we actually want the leaves. So I'm bringing a particle system, and what I'm going to do instead is I'm going to put it onto object, particle instance. As you can see, click on my object. I tried it with a cube first just to see how it was going to work. I haven't done this way before. Normally I'd use a particle system, just spread it around those objects, but I thought I'd try a different way. And now you can see I've got it working. I just need to make sure they're the right scale and make sure that they all go into place, which you can see now they do once I put them back. So now I know it works. I'm going to create a leaf. And I'm going to do the same thing. So particle instance. I just need to make sure they're all kind of different scales, all rotated around. And then what I'll do then is just put them on top of my leaves, like so. I can get rid then of the bottoms of them. You can see they're not kind of rotated around. And now I'm just messing around, seeing how many I can get away with. Do I need children on these? And how many leaves do I actually need? I'm not sure whether this system is better than the just standard particle system that I'm used to using. But in the end, the result was pretty nice. Now you can see this is the first time that I'm actually lighting this scene. And you can see I'm using a sky texture. So just open up your shading panel. Go into world and bring the sky texture. And with that sky texture, you can see how powerful it is. It's a really good way if you want some really nice lighting in your scene. Now I use this with a combination of other lights, so it could be point lights and things like that. Could be even a sun, but the actual sky texture itself gives me a lot of good lighting for something that's pretty stylized. I like to mess around with lighting as well. I don't just like to use a HDRI. I don't just like to use just some standard lights, 3-point lighting. I do like to really play around with lighting and see how far I can actually push the actual model, because lighting is the one thing you can do which will either make or break your model. So you'll see all these really nice images on ArtStation, and it's mainly the lighting that's doing all that work. If you take that lighting away and you look at just the materials, it will just be the same as what you've actually built, most likely, except the lighting is done really well. So now I'm just creating some basic food items, putting them in place, and pretty much on this point, I know I'm on the home straight, which is, really nice. I know, I'll be handing it over to Luke to do the texturing. Now to make these noodles, I've basically used a meta bowl. So if you use a meta bowl and you pull them out, you'll see that they kind of squidge next to each other. I don't know if squidge a word, but that's how I imagine it. They actually morph actually next to each other. Really good way of creating, lumps and things like that. I actually use that in the isometric to make the lava lamp as well. So many different ways you can actually use them. Now I'm going to create the actual floor, and the reason I'm creating this floor now is because I've got my basic lighting in, and it is going to give me a really good idea of how the scene's actually going to kind of present itself. The floor is something actually that's really important, so just make sure you don't kind of slack on the floor. It's also, if you're using a transparent background, it's a really good idea to take time to make sure the floor's right, because then when you actually use a transparent background, it's actually going to give it something for your building to actually stand on. So in other words, you don't want your building just sat on a plane. Now I'm just creating a few more food items, which will be the sushi rolls. And at this point, it's basically down to how much do I want to create. Because we could fill this, wok shop up all day long. We could spend 2 days putting in little details. And what we want here is enough details to make it look like it's a living, breathing environment. But we don't need to go overboard. But we do need to make sure, as I said, we put the effort in to make sure it looks as though it's living and breathing. So here I'm just creating some pots, and these will be for either rice or noodles. And everything wants to be haphazard on kind of, builds like this. Things would literally be all over the place. I mean, it's not been shut up. It actually wants to look as though it's actually being used right at this moment. Now I'm just creating a few jugs, and I think it's better off actually if you create 4 or 5 jugs, put them in your asset manager, and then you can actually bring them in anytime you want them. And on every one, just make sure that they're actually unwrapped, because then what you can do is you can actually just bring them in. They're already unwrapped, which means then you can just literally send them through to Substance Painter, and every time you can give them a different material or whatever material you want. You can bake them out. You could even go so far as to have a high poly, and every time you just reduce the amount of polys, and then you've got a high and low in there as well. So you could do it that way. The asset manager is really powerful. One of the best things to come out in Blender. So I highly recommend learning how to use it if you've not done so far. Now what I'm doing is I'm actually creating the cash register. And I want it to be one of those really old style cash registers with the, the little model on top that's moving its hand backwards and forwards, little plastic models. Again, on something like this, as long as we've got the basic shape down, Substance Painter can do most of the work in there. You just need a handle on there as well, which I'm putting in now. And I think all told, probably took 5 minutes to create this. So not that actual long. You can see we've actually got a really nice result once we actually bevel that off. So you can see now we've got a cash register, and I've actually filled up this side now and mirrored that round actually, just so it's facing the right way. And now you can see at this point, really starting to come together. Alright, so now let's move on and actually make sure we stack some of these up, put them in the back, fill up the back. You can see a lot of things now we've already created, which makes it much easier. And now I think we're on to frying pans. So we just need a couple of different frying pans. We can also change them around a little bit and use them as well hanging up. And also take into account as well, whenever you're building anything, make sure you only put you know, the most effort into the things that are actually going to be seen really closely. Unless you're actually making things for the asset manager, then you should actually take the time to actually make as many decent models as you can. But when it's something just like a frying pan that's kind of in the background, there's not a lot of point making, you know, a real concerted effort to make it as hyper realistic as possible. Not a lot of point in that. In fact, if you do that, it's just going to make your scenes take really long, and in the end, you're probably not going to learn so much. So what I mean by that is, you want to really get your basic modeling techniques up to a really decent level, and from there, all you're going to do is kind of speed up your workflow. So what you're trying to do from that point is you're actually trying to then maximize how good your models look from lighting, camera work, and actually setting out grey boxes and the overall look of your actual art. So you can see here all I did with this is got a basic shape, I subdivided it, and then all I'm going to do is just split it with those seams that I've already marked. You can see because I marked those seams before, they actually carried on through, so when I'd applied that subdivision, it was really easy then to just grab each of those islands. Because if you go into face select and you press L, it will only go up to where the seams are marked, which makes it really easy then to split up things. So now I'm just adding some little touches, so like the food cooking away on the stove. And again, I'm going to actually use a boolean just to get rid of the bottoms of those. Really good once you've got something in there. Use the other object to boolean them off. Now you can see we're just creating some basic cutlery, just add to all the plates. One of the things that would have made it probably a little bit easier with this build is to make sure that I actually sort out all of the actual models and things like that into actual groups. So that then would enable me to actually hide parts of the mesh and would make it much easier to actually put things inside the actual kitchen. So now we're down to the actual final parts, which is just some signs. I think after this then we'll start and move on to actual UV unwrapping, making sure normals are okay, making sure all the topology is okay. Oh, and I forgot, we just need to finish off those lights. I was never happy with that light there. It wasn't the right shape, so I'm just going to come in now and actually finish that off. And I'll also add one more square light, just to give it a little bit more atmosphere. And make sure you stay till the actual UV unwrapping. We do use a couple of add-ons, which make the process very easy. And anything we really use, most of the time is free anyway. Selection is going to be what's actually unwrapped and what isn't. And you can see there that what I'm using is Text Tools, a free add-on. And what it can do is it can actually bring in that grey and white checkerboard. You just one click and it puts that on for you. And what that enables you to do then is see exactly the resolution, which is really important when you send it out to actually texture something, of all of the parts. So what you basically want to do is make sure that all of the parts, you can see there I've got some stretching. I actually fix that by resetting my transformations, and then I come to unwrap it. And you can see I've got another add-on there which is called UV Packmaster. And UV Packmaster is really great because what it does is it actually packs everything really much better than actual Blender does. So we also use Text Tools and UV Packmaster to actually UV unwrap and actually pack them into place. You can see what else I did there was I just made sure as well that all the normals are facing the right way. You can see on this bit as well that what I was talking about with getting rid of all of those edges. First of all, I decided to go in and try and delete them manually. And then I simply pressed A, come up to Mesh, clean up, and then delete loose ends. That worked out much better. You can see as well this roof. is not the same resolution as the rest of it. So I fixed that and now it's all the same. So basically what we do here, we press U, we automatic unwrap. We then basically use the text tools to make sure the resolutions are all the same. And then what we do is we pack them. We make sure we have average island scale. And then we use the UV Pack Master to actually pack them much, much closer. And what that enables us to do is to get a much higher resolution on our textures, because obviously we're using more UV space. So it's really important that you actually do that. Basically, you want to be packing UVs as close as you possibly can. And we normally give it an island of 3, which is 3 pixels all the way around every UV island. And this means then if there's any kind of, overlap on the textures where you're painting them, it's called bleed, and normally you get that. But if you've got like 3 pixels each side, then that actually stops that happening. So you can see there that the problem is that I need to turn those into a mesh, which they weren't. That's the thing with the metal balls. Just make sure you're converting them to mesh. And now you can see that this hasn't actually unwrapped properly. So on some items like this and like the fish, you're going to have to go in and add in some actual seams. It makes it really easy because you're going to be using triplanar projection in Substance Painter.
Alright, now to start it off, I usually get myself an entire mesh into the Substance Painter and just bake out the textures just to see if everything is sorted out properly, if there are problems with non-manifold edges, or if there's any of the faces that have flipped normals. But after we check that out, I then go back into the entire setup and just rebake everything out into 4K textures. Even though we're not texturing them out in 4K resolution themselves, it's usually best to bake everything out in high resolution, especially for the ambient occlusion and curvature masks. So later on when we are upscaling, if we're upscaling it, it won't cause us any issues and we won't have to redo that type of a process. And yeah, once I had it sorted, I just made sure to bake out everything except for the fish sign to make sure that I'm adding some additional high topology details. So I just had to bake that out separately with a high topology type of a setup. And I went into the texturing process and I started off with actually a smaller bit of a detail, the plant pot. I'm not quite sure why I started that at the very start. I just didn't want to start on the fish itself, since I knew it's going to be quite a more complex type of a piece. And although the pot itself is a bit smaller, it is going to be at the frontal in a way and a foreground, so it's going to be quite a lot more visible. And for the wood itself, I was playing around with a previous material that I had set up that I created before, and it's a real nice type of a smart material. It has wood grain and the material, the texture underneath kind of separated, so you can play around with how much of the grain you want it to be visible. And usually I also overlay another color if it's a softer type of an environment. In this case, I wanted to make sure that we don't have too much of a sharp detail, and so for that reason I overlaid just a normal type of a color, kind of bleed out some of that detail for the wood. And yeah, that's exactly what I did for the branches itself. But before doing that, I had to figure out how I'm going to make it follow the flow of a tree branch, and for that I just made sure I convert smart material that I had onto just a simple material, and I played around with just kind of stamping it out, the detail itself, using a brush tool, but it didn't quite work out as well. So what I ended up doing was I used a projection tool and just kind of covered it for the top of my screen, and based on the camera type, based on the angle of it. And yeah, I was basically sorting out the entire type of a grain for the wood. I didn't care much about if it's a little bit too much, because I knew I was able to sort that out and I was able to readjust the overall layout of the tree. And since it was giving me a nice type of a setup for that, I was able to then retweak some of the masks that I had for the smart material that I often use for this type of a bark, to kind of bring out the shape itself a little bit more and highlight some of those crevices and some of those details that you'd usually see on a tree, especially on this type of stylized environment. It's going to look super nice. I just made sure to kind of bleach out everything just to kind of soften it up a little bit with an overlay for a simple color layer. And then the next step that I wanted to texture was going to be the fabric that you see hanging on the top, and I didn't want to make it look too obvious that it's like fabric type. So what I ended up doing is I ended up overlaying a simple fabric material and upscaling it to quite a high value, which gave me that really type fine cloth look for the overall setup. But before doing that, I did use some smart mask to kind of highlight the shapes of the edges, the crevices as well, and to make it look nicer. And then the rest, I just need to make sure I get some of that shape broken up a little bit using some roughness values as well, so it wouldn't just look completely flat. Even though this is a softer type of a touch for fabric, I still wanted to make sure that not only it fits a nicer type of an environment, it also has that bit of an extra detail using PBR values. And yeah, afterwards I started playing around with a wood. I realized that not only did I have to tweak out the wood values for each one of the areas. So for example, for the lamppost, I wanted to make sure it looks a bit more aged, like it's been weathered out a little bit more. But for the inside pieces, I needed to make sure that it hasn't had that much of a weathering effect. So I ended up just simply saturating the colors a little bit more while still keeping that nice polished touch. And yeah, going back to the fabric, I figured that it's not going to highlight this edges as much, so I had to manually go in and brush out that detail myself, which turned out quite nice, if I were to say so myself. And then for the base of the lamppost, I had to set up a nice metal for the overall environment. So I did just that. I did run up into a couple of issues where some of the UVs were basically giving me some nasty seams, so I think I just brushed them out manually while lowering the overall generated mask, which turned out quite nice. And then going back to the inside of the counters, I wanted to make sure that they look quite nice and blend in nicely with the floor itself. So I manually added in some bit of an extra dirt mask for the base of those legs, and it turned out quite nice. It also makes it look like a bit of that extra ambient occlusion type that bleeds in nicely. It gives more depth to the overall setup. And yeah, going back to the plant pot, I realized it looked a little bit too sharp in regards to the overall dirt that it was having. So I upscaled all of the textures to kind of make it look like it has finer type of detail for the dirt, and I just lowered down the ambient occlusion mask so the backside wouldn't look just completely messed out, since the smart mask that I was using was based on generated ambient occlusion mask. And so if an asset is closer to the wall, for example, get ambient occlusion that's a little bit more intense in comparison to the rest of the pieces. If you're setting up some props that are separate from an environment, obviously you wouldn't get that sort of a result. But if you want the props to look like they're more part of the environment, this kind of a setup is really nice, where you just have everything laid out already and you're just texturing the parts out. And yeah, going back to the foundation, and I was trying to set it up to make it look like concrete kind of slabs for those areas. At first, I figured it's going to look quite nice if it looked more like it's outside of an environment, but it didn't turn out quite as nice, to be honest, although I did put in quite a bit of work in setting up this kind of concrete to soften up the overall layout of it. All in all, it just didn't look quite nice for the scene. So yeah, I did end up saving this smart material out because I ended up getting some smooth type of a surface for a concrete material, and I did have some variations using UV random color checker. And yeah, it did make it look real nice overall for the scene, but not for the scene. It wasn't quite as good for that. And yeah, you can still see me playing around with the roughness values, the texture itself, just making sure that it looks quite nice under different lighting conditions as well. So I'm rotating the environment setup as well, and I'm also making sure that I'm making use out of that ambient occlusion generated mask to make sure that it looks like it's part of that environment, to kind of bleed in the values for the color a little bit more, where it's closer to the crevices of the structure. And yeah, afterwards I started just texturing out other pieces, a bit smaller pieces. So the furniture, the stools, I wanted to make sure that they're a similar type of a style for a wood, but it wasn't looking quite the same. So I had to make sure I kind of split it up based on the color variations and whatnot. I also made sure to use position mask as well, which allowed me to create kind of a gradient based on the height of those chairs. So the legs, the stools that were, touching the floor, they had a bit of that moldy type of a look. Not too much though. Obviously, we want to make this kind of a colorful, bright type of a scene, but they don't need to look in a perfect condition, is what I'm saying. So yeah, all in all, I think it turned out quite all right. And in regards to the wood as well, one more thing that I'd like to mention is how I make use out of the grain scaling. So often what you'd see is that when you're scaling up textures, you'd usually have the proportions, the ratio of the wood set in the right type of aspect, and they're always usually locked in. But in Substance Painter, you can just click off that lock that's between the two in a tiling, and you can manually control them. And yeah, by increasing one of the values, by stretching out that wood pattern, you're able to make it look like it's a lot smoother type of a wood. It doesn't quite work if you don't have enough of tiling, but it does work quite nicely if the tiled material is already set up. So it's like, for example, it's tiled in x-axis by 6 and in y-axis by, let's say, 8 or 10. And just by doing that, you're able to kind of stretch out the entire pattern and make the entire wood look quite a lot finer. And vice versa, if you do the opposite, if you stretch out in another direction, you can make the wood look quite a lot rougher. But of course, you'd need to readjust some height values, for example. So it comes with some extra bits that you need to readjust basically. But yeah, on each material you gotta slightly adjust and tweak some values. And I do want to say that I am using a lot of smart materials creating these kind of environments. But what you need to know is that you gotta understand how each one of the layers work usually to actually make full use out of them, because each environment, each setup, it has a different type of a look, different positioning for those pieces. And so what you gotta do is just you gotta readjust each mask manually. So for example, if it's a position mask where you are using based on the height of an object, obviously you'll want to tweak that depending on how high up that object is within your environment. And afterward, I decided to start on creating the sign, the post. At first, I figured that just a couple of letters in a Japanese type of a font would look quite nice. I did try to make use out of the Google Translate to get some more interesting phrases, which might not look quite as nice for a native speaker, but all in all, it just gives that nicer bit of a vibe. You will see though that I am ending up changing that because the sign does look quite simplistic for such a grand type of a selection within the piece. So yeah, and do end up changing that, but just going through that kind of a phase and checking how it looks does help you with designing the overall setup and making sure that it looks quite nice. And yeah, another thing that I should probably mention is that even though I don't exactly understand the phrases on what it's saying, it's still quite nice to add that bit of an extra detail to your pieces just to make sure that it looks part of the environment. Although using Google Translate might not be the best type of a solution for that, but yeah, you will see that it's just a placeholder for now, and I will end up changing that. And going to the fish now, it was quite exciting to start that off because for starters, I just applied a simple solid color and then I wanted to paint it in, but I was painting it not just using some manual kind of brushes in and out. I was making sure to use some generated masks, and for starters, I made use out of a thickness generated mask to give that kind of a plasticky, cartoonish type of a look for the fish to make it look like it's been painted. Then I also made use out of a position to kind of give some lighter up touches for the top and some darkened touches for the bottom as well. And then to make sure that it looks like it's popping out within that kind of environment, I made use out of a light generator, which allowed me to kind of give some fake light bounces and create a mask that makes it look like there's some gloss on that type of a piece that has been painted on to make it look like the sign is being popping out. So basically you gotta make it look like it's a fake gloss on purpose, like it's been painted on by hand, and that's exactly what I tried to achieve. Then I played around with some colors. I made use out of green a little bit just to kind of break up the overall fish, but I didn't realize how badly it'll look in regards to this overall type of a setup. So I ended up just going back and changing it back to blue color, although some variation was still needed for the fins. So I made sure to do that, which all in all, it did turn out quite alright. And whilst masking those fins, because they were decimated or retopologized in such a nice way, I was able to make use out of the overall flow for a topology. And once I was done with that, I wanted to get some bit of a pattern out of the fish, but I didn't want to get like a realistic type of a fish pattern. So I actually went on to Blender, and I have a Dream add-on that up, and I just typed in a fish pattern, and it just gave me some really bizarre type of patterns throughout the entire setup. So I just kept on generating it until I found something I liked, and I did actually make use out of that. I made sure to create myself a pattern that I liked, and I did go into Photoshop to kind of tweak out that pattern a little bit just to make sure it looks nicer whilst it's being overlapped with one another, which all in all, I think it turned out quite nicely. So then afterwards, all I had to do is just import it in as an alpha and overlay it for the fish. And yeah, it turned out quite alright. And then I just had to mask out the areas where I didn't like them to be. So yeah, I think the fish turned out quite alright in regards to the pattern. I had to make sure I softened it up to make it look like it was just printed onto like a soft plastic type of a look. And once I was happy with that, I added a couple of extra touches in regards to highlight some of the details. So for example, for the gills, I wanted to make sure I add some crevice, and I just manually kind of based that around that, based the gills kind of edge around that. And then I added a bit of an extra touch to the lips, and I wanted to paint out some custom type of a fake glossiness that you'd see on the fish itself. It didn't quite give us the nice result for the fins, for the top fin to be exact, so I ended up painting that in myself, and it turned out quite nicely. Although looking back, maybe I should have softened that up. I think I do come back to soften it up a little bit to kind of make it look more fitting towards the overall fish itself. And yeah, once I was happy with that, I started tweaking out the main sign itself. I didn't quite like it. I wasn't sure what to do about it, so what I ended up doing is I ended up just leaving it in as is, since I realized that if I don't know how to fix it now, I'll come back to it later, and I'll be able to come up with a better solution by just seeing how the overall environment looks later on. So yeah, I continued on working with that. Originally, I wanted to make the tiles look blue and to make it look like it's a bit more of a cartoonish type of a style, and just to kind of brighten up the overall environment. But I didn't realize how bad it'll look in comparison to making it a fish pop out, because the fish itself is blue, the sign itself is blue. It ended up kind of blending in too much in regards to that, and yeah, I ended up just changing that to a red type of a tile after all. But before doing that, I just made sure that I have enough variations, so the bits that break off the surface ended up just making them darker, and also the tiles themselves, I used UV chunk randomizer to kind of get a random mask for it, and that way I was able to again break off the surface of those tiles. And then going back to the wood itself, because this entire environment is set up into multiple materials, I had to basically set up the materials for each one of the layers. Although the downside of it is that it actually causing some slowdown, especially when you're using smart materials where it has multiple masks from generators. And if you have a lot of smart materials going through multiple of those texture set lists, we're going to have some performance issues. So that I did experience that. You'll see that by the end of it, I was struggling to change some colors when doing the texturing part. And yeah, in the end, the main reason because of it was basically, instead of just creating some variations through the smart material itself by using the smart material itself, I just made multiple duplicates out of them sometimes to just get nicer variations again out of it. But yeah, the downside is that it was harder to work with the performance that I was having. Yeah, going back to the tiles of the stairs, I ended up using brick a layer generator and some curvature mask to highlight those crevices a little bit. If you're able to use anchor points, you're able to set yourself up with your own custom type of generated curvature masks, and that turns out really nice in the end. And yeah, I just made sure that it looks quite nicely stylized and highlighted for those patterns of bricks. And afterwards I started doing the texturing for the inside part. There were so many pieces to texture, and honestly, we did consider beforehand, especially Neil did mention how it might be easier to set it up for each asset to be just kind of duplicates, so we'd be able to save up not only on the texture but on the workflow time itself. But basically it doesn't help us in regards to how customized we want the piece to be. So for example, if it's closer to the floor, if I want it to be kind of a little bit more dirty or something like that, something that's going to be just a duplicate is going to be in a different position. It's not going to look quite as nice later on when we place it in another area, basically. And having each one of those pieces as individual UV kind of spaces, it helps to get unique type of detail throughout each one of them. But yeah, the downside of it is that the texturing side takes a long time, and especially the biggest time consuming thing that ended up happening was basically because of the masking. Each one of those smaller pieces need to be masked out individually and kind of repurposed just to make sure that we get a nicer variation. And speaking of variation, I did end up for metal to creating, I think, 3 type of color variations. So for frying pans, you'd see me using darker type of metal, whereas for the fridge, it would have a lighter type of metal. And yeah, once I was happy with the wood, the main wood at least, I then realized that I need some variation of material. So I ended up making some glass variations as well. So for example, for the pepper shakers and bottles that are to the side of them, they wanted to be a bit of a different color. So I ended up changing that a little bit. And as for the kind of meat, the vegetables that were cut up in the environment, I wanted to make sure that they look appetizing and nice in color. So lots of saturation is needed, whilst at the same time, they do need to look not as plasticky or whatever, that type of sort. So I ended up using some noise variation as well for the height. So that gave me some bump values, especially for the meat. It looks quite greasy, quite natural, I think, in regards for such a small prop within this type of environment. So from a distance, I think it's going to look quite nice. And I ended up just painting in those small type of white bones in the middle or on the side, just to kind of break up the surface facade and just to make it look again like it's a chunky type of a meat that already has a bone inside. And yeah, playing around with the environment, just adjusting the glass variation for each one of the bits. And going on to the poster, I wanted to make sure I make it look quite nice and special. So I did, for starters, figured that I'd add a simple type of a material for the paper and then stamp out some detail later on. But I ended up just overlaying the entire setup afterwards anyways. But the roughness values and the height channel did end up staying the same. So that was quite nice. Now, as for the food itself, I wanted to make it look a little bit more nicer. At first, I wanted to maybe overlay a texture of like ramen or something, but it wasn't quite fitting for this type of a scene. I wanted to simplify it a little bit. So what I ended up doing was I ended up using physical particles within Substance Painter, which kind of spreads out some type of texture around. And for the noodles, especially, that worked out really, really nice. So it didn't like make it too overwhelming, I reckon. It just kept it as a nice type of noodle type of a bowl. And for the bit that I'm making texturing green part of the food, I figured that's going to be like some sort of a dessert or something of that. But no, in the end, I did change that back up to make it look more like noodles. That changed it up nicely. And there was a tiny fish inside of the bar as well, so I ended up just playing around with that. Although it's such a small type of detail, just leaving it plain wasn't looking quite nice, so I ended up just getting a nice texture to kind of stamp it out. And because it's going to be such a small texture, it's not going to matter much, but Still, just by doing that, I was able to kind of overlay it with the color that I had previously, and that gave us so much more detail looking from a distance even, that it just made a big difference to it. Although the eye is not going to be visible, I just stamped it in real quick and I just left it as plain as is, because that also doesn't give much of a difference to this type of a setup for the environment. And then I played around with how the rice, for example, is going to be within sushi. And it turned out quite nice by just having some white plain type of material with a bit of a noise added to it. I think I used cloud noise for that, and just by increasing the contrast and adding some height variation, it gives us some real nice type of a setup for it. Of course, I didn't want to overdo it in regards to detail, because this is going to be such a small type of detail that I didn't actually have to texture individual grains for that. As for the eggs, I wanted to make them look extra nice, but the default kind of a shape, I wasn't quite happy with how it was turning out for the texture, so I ended up using some smart material masking, the thickness masking to be exact with some level adjustments to get that bit of an extra type of translucency, I suppose, that fake translucency out of an egg, to make it look, I guess, more like greasy, of that kind of a greasiness from that egg, and just overall bring out the shape. And then afterwards I got some extra detail out of gas canisters in the back as well. We have a lot of options to work with in regards to the signs, the hazard signs. The Substance Painter already has a lot of those, so it was easy to pick like a fire hazard type of a bit symbol for a canister. I think that worked out quite nice. And yeah, after playing around with the colors, after adjusting some of the edge kind of curvature a little bit as well, I just left it as is and pretty much went on with the rest of the texturing. Now for the other bits, I was going on with the fabric, with the back texturing as well, because it's going to be at the background. I didn't care much about detail, but we did need to make sure we add some fabric kind of highlighted bits for it. And yeah, I wanted to play around a little bit with the folds as well, but I realized it's not going to be needed in the back, so I just ended up keeping it the same. And as for the posters for the menu for the texture detail, I just made use actually out of a AI generated type of textures. I got some variations out of them because it's going to be such a small detail, but I didn't want to leave it plain. I wanted to make it look like it's actually nice and colorful. I just didn't want to spend too much time working on it myself, to be honest, to set it up. So making use out of AI is just a simple tool to kind of get in some of that extra detail in smaller parts where it's not necessarily going to be the main focus of your environment. I think that is totally fine. Although I do know a lot of people who are not okay with AI. I'm not sure personally if it is or not. Let me know if you prefer to use such tools like generating using AI or not, in the comments down below. As again, I'm not quite sure how people like using that sort of stuff anyways. But yeah, going back to the piece, I then changed up the sign, added a bit of a texture as well with it. I made sure to create an opacity texture as well for it, so I wouldn't just create a square type of a texture stamp, just to make sure it looks quite nice within the area. And yeah, all of the techniques, all of the texturing styles, you can find those out in our online courses. We have a couple of Substance Painter courses as well for you to check out. They show pretty much everything you need to know in order to set up 3D environments, and we have a lot of variations, so you're free to choose basically any type depending on the style you want to go for. And yeah, going back to the environment, when I was creating the oven in the back side, I just wanted to make sure I have some nicer color variation out of it, so I did end up creating a brass variation out of my metal, just to make it look a little bit nicer for the scene, for the setup. But I didn't want to make it stand out too much, so I kind of darkened the color a little bit, and that made it, I think, blend in nicely with the overall scene, while still keeping giving us some nice variation. But yeah, going to that oven, I didn't quite like how it was just attached to the entire chunk of the block, the oven itself. So the doors, around the doors, I actually made use out of the curvature tool. I set it up, curvature mask that is. I set it up as a crevice, and I kind of used I think levels to make sure that it sharpens it up, and then that makes it look like there's a mask going all the way around it. And I made use out of that to get a nice border of metal to be going around those kind of doors, to make it look like they're slightly detached from the wall itself. And I think that turned out quite nicely. And as for like the cans, I wanted to add some detail to them as well. So it's like adding smaller detail, although I know in the end, in the back, they're going to look more like noise. I still want to have some colorful variation for those schematics for those cans. So yeah, once I was happy with the detail in the back, I realized that I wanted to add a bit of an extra detail at the front as well for the plates. So I added a bit of a different material for the bits, for example, where the sushi is at, those kind of squarish plates. I realized that they're meant to be more of a stone, black kind of stone look. And I wanted to add a bit of a pattern to it. And I remembered that there is a really nice pattern for a hammered metal that I could make use out of, so I made use out of that. Of course, I'm not going to set it up as a metal itself. I just wanted to make use out of it to get that pattern out of the way. So I just made sure that it only is affecting height channel, and that turned out real nice after all. And yeah, I just played around with a little bit of roughness, although it's supposed to be of a smooth surface and a clean type of a plate. A little bit that extra bit of a roughness value, I think, goes a long way in regards to breaking up the surface. Otherwise, it's going to look completely smooth, and that's going to make it look a little bit unnatural, let's say, even whilst working on a cartoonish type of a scene. And yeah, as for the plates themselves, the ones that are stacked up, figured that they're not going to look quite as nice overall whilst being stacked up with the same color. So I just kind of varied the color a little bit. And yeah, going back and forth, there were a couple of areas that I needed to fix essentially. For example, next to the stairs, there was one piece that was not giving me the right kind of results out of generating a mask. So I had to manually adjust that out of the way, get me some nicer results. And there were some issues for where the generating masks were a bit closer to the surface than I wanted them to be, and that gave us some really nasty kind of results for like it darkened up the overall setup for a material. So I had to readjust that as well. And then going back to the back, the back itself looked way too plain, although it was a stylized type of a setup, and we didn't want to add too much detail for the background to kind of bring out shapes out of the foreground. We still needed to make sure we have certain amount of detail out of them. So just generating a couple of bricks in a similar way that I did for the stairs turned out quite well, although I made them look like they've been painted over with white paint. But I wanted to make it look a bit more kind of like a back street alley type of a look. So I did break that up with a grunge type of a mask, and I think that turned out quite nice overall. And yeah, looking back at it, maybe I should have added a bit of extra crevices to them as well, like I did for the stairs themselves. But I added minimalistically in regards to that, and I think it turned out quite nice. And yeah, going back to the inside of the restaurant, the bit where I thought was meant to separate the area with a bamboo type of a door, it turned out they're meant to be more of a straw pieces kind of hanging around the color type of a bits. And so yeah, I ended up changing that a little bit as well, and it turned out quite nice. I did end up using some variations going directional horizontal kind of lines, just to kind of break up the surface. And because I knew they have different UVs, it kind of randomized the overall setup. At first I used the position mask to kind of get some color on the top that had white stripes, and then the bottom pieces would have red stripes, and that again made it look quite nice. But yeah, to get some variation, I made use out of some grunge to split that up. And after playing around with the color a little bit, I just left it as a red and white type of a look, and that gave us some really nice type of results. And yeah, going back and forth with the setup, now making sure that the bits hanging pieces from the front would look quite nice as well. I made sure to make them look quite nice. I actually copied the material from the fabric hanging from the front and just applied it onto those smaller type of flags, let's say, to make it again look like it's part of the same scene. And yeah, just playing around with the overall setup, materials, making sure that everything is masked out properly. Throughout this entire process, you can see that my setup, my order of assets, or rather small materials and all of its layers, are actually all over the place. I didn't bother about setting them up. I just want to get on with the workflow and kind of really get into it. But that comes back kind of with its own downsides when I wanted to make sure that I applied the same material onto other pieces. For example, I needed to go back and readjust them. I had to like make sure I find the right type of pieces that I was trying to adjust the materials for. And the final piece that I had to do was basically set ourselves up with some nice emission for those lanterns hanging on outside. And to start off, I wanted to make them actually yellow, and that made it look like nice, kind of a warm glow, but it didn't quite stand out as much because everything is already so colorful and there's so much red and orange within this piece. I wanted to make sure that I actually set that up with more of a white type of lanterns, and I think all in all that turned out quite nice. And yeah, the last couple of things that I needed to do was basically just small tweaks and adjustments. Again, the thing at the back, for example, the oven needed to be changed to completely metal, otherwise it wouldn't look quite as nice where there's so much heat for it to be wood like that. And I added some bit of extra detail to the sushi itself. Again, it's such a small detail, it's not going to be much noticeable, but that kind of bit of an extra contrast with the white rice, I think that definitely is visible from within the environment itself. So I just made sure to have that detail in. And going back to the sign, I realized it looks a little bit plain and empty. And yeah, I did end up using some like those Japanese letters to make sure that I had some extra detail. Although I will say this, I think I rotated them the wrong way, and that makes them actually unreadable. Overall, aesthetically, it looks quite nice, but I'm not sure if it's actually for a native speaker is going to look quite nice. But yeah, the sign itself, I'm quite actually happy with it. I added some color overlay for it as well, just to kind of break up the shape and make it look like it's part of a scene. And of course, to end it off, I just had to export everything out for the Blender and leave it up to Neil to finish it up. So yeah, that's it for me. Thank you for watching, and now let's move on to rendering it out.
So now I've actually got my textures, and all I'm going to do now is bring them in. So you can see now I'm just bringing all of my textures in, and basically with that, the materials are already on there, they're already named. And now all we can do is just bring them in and sort out things like the emission. And now it's on to the actual lighting. So you can see really quickly to bring those textures in. And now I just want to set up my actual lighting of my scene. So what I've done is I've brought in a plane, I've extruded the plane up, I've beveled off that edge just to give it that nice round appearance. And now what I'm going to do is I'm just going to work on my sky texture. So I'm going to get the right color that I want it. And generally you should spend a long time actually sorting out your lighting to be exactly as you want it. So once I've got my lighting right, what I'm going to do then is I'm going to render it out. And then what I'm going to do is I'm going to go into the compositing. Now we are using a paid add-on for rendering. It's called Turbo. And honestly, it's such a game changer when it comes, especially for things that we're doing, because we're making a lot of different scenes, a lot of different animations, and it speeds up the process by at least 10 times, something like that. So a real game changer with that. Now you can see what I've also done here is I've actually rendered out the ambient occlusion as well as the actual color map. And now I can actually use the ambient occlusion in the actual compositing with a denoise on there. The ambient occlusion always comes through with noise. So what I tend to do is just use a denoise and then use a mix, and I overlap the color and the ambient occlusion together. Then what I do is I basically bring in a glare. Then I bring in a sharp to control how sharp the image is. And then I bring in a color balance. Then I bring in a RGB curves, and finally hue and saturation, just to kind of clean it up a little bit more, as you can see. Adding a final brightness and contrast. I'm just thinking if there's anything else I missed on there. So the color balance, that is a really important node. what that'll do is it'll basically enable you to get the right colors that you're actually looking for. So you can see it went from really saturated, and it's basically been desaturated out, and you can see this is the final result that I ended up with. You can see we've got a load of gleam on that actual cleaver, and it's basically looking now as though the sun's kind of going down, the lights are coming out, and everybody's having a great time. So that, everyone, is how we put together our stylized Japanese wok restaurant. I hope you really enjoyed this one. Please drop a comment down below of if we can actually make these more interesting, if we can do, you know, a certain scene that you'd like to see, and really any ideas of how we can get our content out to more people. Alright everyone, so I hope you enjoyed that, and I'll see you on the next one. Happy modeling, thanks a lot, bye bye.